They called him a boy without a father. Yet the records suggested otherwise. His baptism was entered in the parish book with his mother's name alone, the space for a father left blank. But years later, the same ledger carried his name again, this time written in the column reserved for fathers, as though he had begotten himself. Those who saw him in life remembered the sameness of his face. It did not change with age, but echoed upon itself, familiar in ways no child's should be. Neighbors whispered he was his own sire, both origin and offspring, a circle that could not be broken. If the boy was both father and son, where does the line of bloodline begin, and where does it end? And if such a thing is possible, what becomes of the generations that follow? Before we step deeper into this file, I want to pause and ask you, where are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? Leave your place and hour in the comments below. It helps us know how far these forgotten stories travel. And while you are here with us, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Classified Ledger, so records like these can be brought to light once more. The boy anomaly. They said the boy looked like no one else, yet also like everyone who came before him. His face was an echo, the kind that repeats not once but endlessly, circling back upon itself until it seemed less like flesh than a reflection trapped in glass. To see him was to feel something had folded inward, collapsing father into son, past into present. In whispers carried down the ridge, people spoke not of who his father was, but whether he had one at all. The parish ledger offers the first trace, a baptismal entry in the neat hand of the clerk, every column filled but one, the mother's name, written clearly, the date of christening, precise, the location of the ceremony, ordinary. Yet the line for father remained blank, a space of silence that seemed to weigh heavier than any word that might have been written. Later, in the same ledger, many pages onward, the boy's name appears again, not as a child, but as a parent, written into the column of fatherhood in a different baptismal entry. The date does not align. The ages do not align. The handwriting is the same, the ink from the same well. And yet, there he is, entered twice, once as son, once as father. Such a duplication might be called a clerical error, were it not for the annotations. In the margin, faint scratches remain where the clerk appears to have tried to explain the anomaly. The words are half erased, the ink diluted by repeated strokes, but fragments survive. Resembles, followed by a blot. No witness, followed by a strike. What endures is not clarity, but the sense of hesitation, as though the recorder himself feared what the record implied. Descriptions of the boy in oral accounts match the unease of the ledger. His eyes were said to have the weight of memory, the kind that does not belong to childhood. His mouth bore the crooked shape of another's, yet no other could be named. Neighbors said he carried the look of a man too old for his years, and yet in him they recognized only himself folded inward and reflected outward. When he walked, they said, the resemblance was stronger still, not resemblance to his kin, but to himself, as though his gait, his bearing, even the turn of his head, were repetitions of a pattern too enclosed to escape. Children whispered that he was his own father. Adults did not say so aloud, but their silences confirmed it. In time, the parish tried to remove the duplication from the record. The second entry was scraped at, the page marred, but the ink beneath endured. No erasure was complete. The boy's name remains twice in the book, as if two versions of him were always present, one born and one begetting, one child and one parent. To speak of him was to invite unease, so few did. Yet the record endured, passed between hands, folded in drawers, carried into the archives where it remained hidden until noticed again. And so the story begins, not with a place, but with a boy who should not have been possible. To understand how such a child could exist, one who bore the name of both son and father. One must first look beyond the page, to the hollow that shaped him, a hollow where no outsiders had entered for generations. The ridge was not merely a place, but a pact. Outsiders saw only trees, shale, and crooked paths, but those who lived within its fold knew it as a boundary. For decades, no new surname had crossed its edge. Marriage records confirmed what the living already knew. Every bride was kin to her groom, every witness another relative, every vow taken beneath the weight of familiarity. The hollow was not shaped by geography, it was shaped by decision, a deliberate closing of gates that no road could open. Family Bibles preserved the proof. Page after page bore the same cluster of names, repeated until the ink itself seemed weary of their return. Children were christened with their father's forename, mothers with their grandmothers, sons with their uncles. To trace the branches of any family tree was to find it curling back on itself, root meeting limb, generation collapsing inward. Gravestones in the churchyard whispered the same truth. In the moss and lichen, a repetition could be read, surnames etched side by side, sometimes 3 in a row, as if the stones were copied rather than carved anew. Some bore birth and death dates so close together, it seemed entire lives had barely been lived. Others stretched a little longer, but always with the same names, the same blood, returning to the same soil. Weddings did not mark expansion, but consolidation. Old witnesses recalled that when the vows were spoken, there was often a phrase added beneath breath, unrecorded in the parish ledger, "No outsider shall join us." It was not a curse, nor a superstition, but a vow kept with the fervor of survival. To them, purity of blood was safety, and safety demanded sealing. Yet what safety did it bring? Children were born bearing not the features of far-off ancestors, but the mirrored traits of their cousins. A crooked jaw in one branch appeared again 2 houses over. A lilt in the eyes of a young bride was seen again in her nephew. The community folded in upon itself until even resemblance became a form of inheritance. The result was a hollow where no stranger could belong and no kin could escape. Their world was finite, bounded by hills and by their own will, a self-contained loop where every name, every vow, and every grave repeated upon itself. This was the soil into which the boy was born. His strangeness was not created in isolation, but in culmination. Generations had prepared the ground for him. Every repeated name, every forbidden union, every vow whispered against outsiders. When he came into the world, the hollow had already prepared him, though no one yet understood how far the pattern would bend. It was within this closed circle that the first record of him appeared. The parish ledger, already heavy with repetition, bore a new entry. His name was there, his mother's beside it. But where the column for father should have been, there was nothing. A silence recorded in ink. The boy's first trace in official memory was not his cry, nor his step, but a line of ink. The parish ledger held it, a baptismal entry written with the same neat hand that had recorded every child of the hollow. Yet even at a glance, it was clear this line bore a weight the others did not. The mother's name stood plainly, her letters steady, unremarkable. The date of the baptism was entered, the location of the rite as it had always been. The stone font, the same hymn, the same water, drawn from the spring behind the church. Nothing in those details marked him as different. It was the column for the father that broke the rhythm. There, the clerk had left a silence. The pen had hovered, ink pooling into a hesitant blot, before moving on. The space where a name should have been lay empty, as though it resisted being filled. In all the years of the parish records, there were widows, there were men gone to war, there were fathers lost to mines or illness, yet never had the line been left untouched. A name, however absent, was always given. To leave it blank was to speak aloud what no one wished to say, that no father could be written, because no father could be known. Some who saw the ledger later whispered that the blot itself seemed deliberate, as if the clerk had pressed his nib down too long, hoping to obscure what had not been entered. Others claimed they could see faint letters beneath, scratched and then rubbed out, though none could agree on what they had once been. What was clear was that the omission was not oversight, but refusal. The entry did not remain alone. When the clerk closed the book, those who had gathered for the baptism carried the silence with them. They spoke in lowered tones, wondering whether the mother had hidden a name, whether shame or secrecy had demanded the omission. But in time, even the most skeptical admitted that her face gave nothing away, and the boys offered no answers. Yet his appearance unsettled them more than the blank space on the page. As he grew, neighbors began to remark that his face did not simply resemble his kin, but that it seemed to repeat itself. His features bore a strange continuity, as though he were not a child of mixed inheritance but a closed circle, containing only himself. The curve of his mouth was echoed in his eyes, the set of his brow mirrored in his jaw. It was as if he had been copied, rather than conceived, folded inward instead of branching outward. And so the parish record, with its empty column, came to be matched by the living record of his face. What the book withheld in words, the boy carried in flesh, a silence repeating upon itself. The townspeople grew uneasy. They began to whisper not just about the missing father, but about the boy himself. His resemblance was not to a man unseen, but to himself alone, a reflection without origin. What kind of child bore features that seemed to echo only themselves? And how far could such a resemblance go, when every year he grew older, and yet looked always like the same repeating face? The ledger told only part of the story. The rest lived in the faces of those who saw him, and in the words they spoke when they thought no one was listening. The boy's appearance unsettled the hollow in ways they could not easily name. His features did not combine or clash like those of most children. They repeated. The eyes seemed copied from themselves, set too symmetrically, holding a gaze too rehearsed. The mouth was described as familiar, but not in the way of kinship, rather as an echo, as though it remembered itself from another age. Neighbors began to notice the strangeness early. One recalled seeing him at 5 years old and remarking privately that he looked no different than he had at 2. Another swore that when he turned 10, his face was simply a continuation of what it had been, like a pattern too rigid to allow change. Even as his body grew, his features seemed locked in place, unable to alter, unable to forget themselves. Children at the schoolhouse turned whispers into play. They dared one another to stand beside him and look closely, to see whether his reflection in the window blinked at the same time. One was heard to say, in tones both mocking and afraid, "He looks like his own father." It was a phrase that stuck, passed from child to child, until even adults repeated it under breath. Some said it as jest, others as warning. Few said it in his mother's hearing. His presence in public spaces carried an unease. At services, when families gathered in the small church, there were those who tried not to meet his gaze. When he walked down the aisle, his reflection in the polished wood of the pew seemed too sharp, too aligned with itself. In daylight, he appeared ordinary enough, but in the half-shadow of dusk, his face seemed a mirror, placed against itself, folding backward without end. The community had always tolerated resemblance, cousins looking like uncles, brothers sharing the jawline of their fathers. But this was different. The boy's face did not call to mind another relative. It called to mind only itself. No lineage could be seen in it, no inheritance traced. It was a face without origin, and that absence left those around him uneasy. In time, the whispers grew heavier. They began to ask, not aloud but in cautious glances, whether his likeness was a symptom of something deeper, a bloodline folded too many times. a family tree whose branches curled back until nothing new could grow. If the parish had allowed itself to write truth plainly, the record might have said as much, but instead the truth was hidden in ink. The parish ledger, where his name first appeared, bore more than the blank column. In its margins, faint notations had once been made, only to be scratched out later. The lines remain, ghosted beneath the paper's surface, as though the record itself had hesitated, then recoiled. Those who glimpsed the marks spoke of them only in hushed tones, their meanings blurred, but their existence undeniable. What could have been so troubling that the clerk himself sought to erase it? And what did those hidden words once say about the boy who was both son and father? The parish ledger did not remain silent. Though the father's column for the boy's baptism had been left empty, the clerk's hand had not resisted the urge to comment. In the margin, beside the child's name, faint words were once written. They remain visible, only in fragments now, the rest buried beneath scratches, where ink has been scored and erased. Those who examined the page decades later noted the texture before the words. The parchment fibers were worn thin, as if the nib had been pressed too many times in the same place. The ink bled in small dark clusters, but not enough to cover the impressions beneath. When held at a slant, the ridges of old strokes revealed a hesitation, a start of words never completed, letters only half formed before they were crossed out. What can be read is incomplete. Resimb. And below it, no wit. The rest vanishes into scratches, layered lines that appear almost frantic compared to the careful script of the original entry. It was as if the clerk himself feared that his attempt to explain might condemn him for having written it at all. The presence of those notes was no secret in the hollow. Word spread quickly after someone, a schoolmaster's wife, according to rumor, saw the marginalia while searching for her own family's entries. She told others that the clerk had once tried to describe the boy in writing, only to think better of it. Soon, whispers turned into speculation, that the erased words had named someone, or worse, had admitted that no one could be named. Theories multiplied in the silence. Some claimed the notes recorded a resemblance too close to the boy himself, an acknowledgement that he bore no difference from his own reflection. Others argued the words might have been a confession by the clerk, unable to reconcile what he had seen with what he was asked to record. All agreed on one point, that whatever truth had been written down was quickly considered too dangerous to leave standing. For years afterward, families would lower their voices when the ledger was brought out, as if the book itself carried an accusation. Children were hushed when they pointed to the scratched page, told not to ask questions in the church where silence had become doctrine. Even the act of turning to that leaf seemed weighted, as if the binding of the book strained against revealing it. What survives is less a statement than an erasure, but in its absence, it tells much. The ledger did not falter for any other child. Every other name has its father written. Every other page, free of such frantic corrections. Only here does the record appear to fight against itself, as though the ink wished to speak and the hand wished to silence it. Later, when investigators returned to study the parish records, it was said they asked not only about the entry, but about the birth itself. They wanted to know what the midwife had seen, and why her account differed so sharply from the pages of the book. And so the whispers turned from the parish clerk to the woman who had been present that night. Her testimony, preserved in fragments, would conflict with every official line written since. When the ledger fell into question, eyes turned to the only witness who might give a clearer account, the midwife who had attended the birth. Her records, kept in a small leather-bound notebook, were intended only for herself, a private log of dates, times, and complications. Yet within those pages lay entries that did not align with the parish book, and her words carried unease that even time could not soften. Her testimony, gathered years later by officials, was drawn from memory, but also from those notes. She confirmed that the child had been delivered in a narrow room, its window shuttered even in daylight. She wrote of the mother, pale and silent, speaking little and refusing to call for kin to assist. No father was present, no man's name ever spoken in the hours she spent by the bedside. That much she repeated without contradiction. Yet woven through her recollections were phrases that unsettled even the questioners. At one point she described looking upon the infant and remarking privately that he seemed older than his years, a phrase so jarring that it was copied into the record as she said it. In another fragment, she noted that the child's features seemed familiar in a way I could not place, as though I had seen him before this night. Her notes bore contradictions. In one line she wrote that the labor was ordinary, unremarkable. In another, pressed between the margins, she added that the silence of the mother was unlike any she had seen, and that she herself felt as though she had been intruding on something unfinished. When asked what she meant, she hesitated, then replied that it had felt less like witnessing a beginning than standing at the continuation of something already present. Pressed further, she admitted that she left the house unsettled, uncertain whether what she had seen should be written down at all. She confessed that she had considered omitting the entry entirely, as though the boy's arrival had not occurred. But she did not. The date is there in her ledger, along with the brief note. No father named, no father seen. Those who read her words later found themselves caught between her plain statements and her uneasy hints. She never claimed the child was unnatural, yet her language betrayed a sense of something beyond ordinary birth. The absence of a father in the room was not unusual in itself. Many men were absent, lost to fields or mines, but the way she lingered on that absence, and the way she described the boy's too familiar face, made the silence more damning than if she had named a man outright. Officials, comparing her account with the parish ledger, noted that the contradictions multiplied rather than resolved. Where the book left a blank, the midwife left words too uncertain to close the matter. Together, they formed not a record, but a riddle, one that widened the longer it was studied. And when investigators turned next to the census rolls of the Hollow, they found the puzzle deepening further. For in those pages, the boy appeared not once but twice, as child, and again where only a father's name should have stood. The parish ledger and the midwife's account might have been dismissed as clerical weakness or failing memory, but the census could not be so easily ignored. It was meant to be the most objective record of all. Names and ages, households and occupations, written by men appointed to count what existed and nothing more. Yet in those pages, the boy appeared in a way that defied both order and biology. The census of that year recorded him first in his mother's home. His name was listed beneath hers, age marked in years, status plainly child. The line was unremarkable at a glance, no different from dozens of other children written into the same book. But only a few pages later, in another household not far away, his name returned. This time, the ink recorded him not as a child, but in the place reserved for parent, standing above the names of younger dependents. The age column was wrong, the placement impossible, and yet there it stood. Clerks tasked with gathering the rolls had noticed the anomaly, even as they walked from door to door. One reportedly paused in confusion, remarking in his own notebook that the boy's name had been given twice, once by the mother, once by a relative who insisted he was head of house. Whether it was error or deceit, he could not decide, but he wrote it down because omission seemed riskier than acknowledgement. When the final census volume was compiled, the duplication remained. Some later said it was the result of laziness, others of superstition, as though the recorders themselves feared striking the name from its second place. What was clear was that the census did not simply misplace him, it had recorded him in both roles at once. Child and parent, the same name circling back as though refusing to be bound by sequence. The contradiction was not lost on the townsfolk. Those who read the census, or heard whispers of its content, carried the unease home. To them, it was proof of what had only been spoken in private, that the boy did not merely lack a father, but had taken that place himself, folding roles together, as his face seemed to fold upon itself. Some said the error lay with the clerks, men tired from travel and too willing to repeat names. But others saw it differently. To them, the census had captured a truth no man dared name, a glimpse of a lineage collapsing inward until the son and father were one. Officials reviewing the rolls chose silence. No corrections were ordered, no clarifications written. The book was left intact. Contradictions and all, as if erasure would only give weight to the thing they feared. For years afterward, the census of that year became a subject of unease, consulted only with lowered voices. The page turned quickly past the boy's duplicated presence, and it was not only adults who noticed. Children, sharper in their cruelty, found language for what others hesitated to say. In the schoolhouse, whispers began to circulate that the boy was not simply fatherless, but his own sire, a phrase that carried through chalk-dusted rooms and playground fields, mocking and fearful in equal measure. The schoolhouse was little more than a single room, its walls bare pine, its floor swept but never polished. Children sat at long benches, with their slates resting on knees, chalk dust rising like smoke each time a lesson began. The air was close in summer, icy in winter, yet always heavy with whispers. It was here that the boy's name carried its heaviest weight. Teachers tried to press on with their recitations, arithmetic, scripture, the copied lines of the McGuffey reader, but the undercurrent never stilled. Whenever his slate scratched, other heads turned. Whenever he stood to answer, voices murmured behind hands. The rumor had hardened into a phrase. He is his own father. At first it spread in the sing-song tones of children, repeating what they barely understood. At recess, the chant would circle him. Father and son, both in one. The words clung to him more stubbornly than any lesson learned at the board. Some children laughed as they said it. Others spoke the line with unease, as if repeating an old curse. Teachers tried to correct them. One struck a boy across the knuckles for mocking too loudly. Another dragged a girl outside by the arm, scolding her for blasphemy. Yet discipline never silenced the rumor. If anything, the punishments gave it weight. The children learned to whisper more carefully, passing the words in chalked fragments on slates, erasing them with the sleeve before they could be seen. The boy himself gave them no reason to relent. His face, unchanged year to year, seemed to invite repetition. At 10 he looked as he had at 7, as if his own reflection had simply grown taller, without altering its form. Other boys sprouted freckles or crooked teeth, but his features returned exactly as they had been before. Each year's class photograph, a stern row of children, stiff collars, ribboned hair, showed him like a figure unaged, set between changing faces, like a mirror misplaced among them. The teachers could not deny what they saw. In their reports to the county superintendent, they described him cautiously, steady, reliable, serious in bearing. Yet beneath those words lay the unspoken acknowledgement that his sameness disturbed them. One note, folded into the back of a school register, read simply, "He is as he was." As years passed, the whispers thickened, layering over his lessons like chalk dust that never settled. Some children avoided him altogether, treating him as if contact might mark them with the same fate. Others drew closer, staring at his face as though waiting for it to change. When it did not, their whispers grew bolder, that he was not just his own father, but his own beginning and his own end, a circle drawn without opening. By the time he reached adolescence, the rumor had crossed from schoolyard chant to household murmur. Parents overheard their children repeating it and lowered their voices instead of correcting them. The idea that he was his own sire had become part of the Hollow's vocabulary, a phrase spoken as uneasily as a prayer. It was in this atmosphere that word of him traveled beyond the schoolhouse walls. A county physician, hearing secondhand of the boy whose face did not alter, made note to see him in person. Soon after, the child was taken to the infirmary, where the scrutiny would turn from rumor to record, and his body would be examined as carefully as the ledgers had been. The county infirmary was a low brick building, with barred windows and halls that smelled of chalk dust and carbolic. Records described the boy's first appearance there as routine. His mother had brought him for a minor ailment, a fever or a cough, though no one seemed certain which. What drew the physician's attention was not his complaint, but his presence. The attending doctor noted his appearance with a precision that betrayed unease. In the admission log, he wrote that the boy was well-proportioned, yet oddly repetitive in aspect. No further explanation was offered. Another physician, summoned to examine him more closely, remarked upon his bones, long but fragile, joints too loose in some places, too rigid in others. He recorded a curious symmetry in the face, followed by the phrase, "without evident source." Measurements were taken: head circumference, span of the arms, length of the legs. Each entered neatly into columns, yet alongside the numbers appeared annotations, hesitant and strained. Features unvaried. No progression. Appearance identical to prior description. No earlier record was cited, yet the wording implied the boy had already been seen before, even though this was the first time his name entered the infirmary books. Some physicians sought to explain it as inheritance, a concentration of kinship, too narrow to disguise itself. But even in their clinical language, unease slipped through. One wrote that the resemblance does not extend outward, but circles inward, a phrase so unusual that later reviewers questioned whether it belonged in a medical report at all. Another added, "Patient appears both antecedent and descendant." The words hovered uneasily between science and confession. The boy himself endured the examination in silence. Witnesses noted that he watched the doctors as they measured him, his eyes following each movement of the calipers and rulers, as though he understood he was being recorded not for health but for proof. When asked to speak, he answered plainly, without hesitation, but his voice carried little of childhood. The physicians could not agree on whether he sounded too young for his appearance or too old for his years. When the examination ended, the mother gathered him without comment. She signed nothing, asked no questions, and left as silently as she had entered. The physicians remained behind, reviewing their notes, uncertain how to phrase what they had seen. The official register recorded no abnormality requiring treatment, yet in the private margins of their journals, their words betrayed the truth, that the boy did not fit any category they could name. Copies of their observations were forwarded quietly to county officials. The phrasing was restrained, but the implication was clear enough to demand attention. "Unclassified resemblance anomaly," one report read. "Household review advised." It was an invitation for intervention, couched in clinical form. And so the matter passed from physicians to officials, from private note to sealed file. The boy who had once been only a blank space in the parish ledger was now marked in government ink. Soon the county itself would come to the hollow, carrying with it questions not easily silenced. The arrival of county officials in the hollow was remembered less for what they said than for how little they allowed to be known. Their wagons came up the ridge road in the early morning, carrying men in dark coats and clerks with boxes of blank forms. They went first to the parish, then to the infirmary, and at last to the households, whose names appeared again and again in the records. Neighbors recalled their questions, slow, deliberate, repeated, until answers contradicted one another. How old was the boy? Who was his father? Why did his face resemble only itself? Each family was asked, each reply written down, each silence noted with equal care. The officials spoke little in return, offering neither comfort nor accusation. They only wrote page after page, their pens scratching like insects. in the still air of the church and the houses. Soon they began to gather the documents themselves. Parish ledgers were removed from the desk, carried away in cloth wrappings. Census rolls were lifted from the clerk's office. Even private Bibles were borrowed, if only for the notations they contained. Families who resisted found themselves visited twice, sometimes 3 times, until the books were surrendered. By the end of the week, the officials had filled crates with records, closing the lids with iron clasps. The most unnerving detail was their silence. They did not speak aloud what they had found. They did not name the boy in public, nor accuse the mother of anything. Instead, they carried the evidence away, as if its weight was too great to leave behind. At the courthouse, the files were sorted, bundled and bound in envelopes stamped sealed by order. None were to be opened without further authority, and none ever were. In the hollow, the effect was immediate. Where once there had been whispers and contradictions, now there was only absence. The ledgers were gone. The census books were gone. Even the infirmary notes had been requested and taken. What remained was memory alone, and memory grew less certain with each retelling. Some insisted the boy's name had been erased. Others swore the clerks had seen it entered twice, though no one could prove it now. The silence of the officials spread into the silence of the people. Families who once speculated now closed their doors. Mothers told children not to repeat the old chants. Fathers warned them not to speak the boy's name beyond their own walls. Yet the unease did not vanish with the records. It lingered in the church pews, in the hush of conversations cut short, in the glance that followed the boy each time he walked the road. Without records to anchor the story, the community was left to its own reckoning. And it was there, in the emptiness left by sealed files, that division took root. Some began to call him a blasphemy, a sign of bloodlines folded too far, a child without rightful place. Others, uneasy yet compelled, whispered that his very strangeness was proof of something more, a miracle unrecognized by the state, a mark of divinity where science faltered. The parish grew quiet, but its silence was no longer uniform. Behind closed doors, households chose their own interpretation. Was he curse, or was he blessing? Each answer split the hollow further, until even prayer was no longer shared. The hollow had always gathered beneath a single roof on Sundays, its people bound by hymns and repetition. But after the officials came and the records vanished, the parish no longer held its unity. The boy's presence had unsettled them before. Now, without ledgers to contain the matter, faith itself fractured. Some saw him as a curse, a visible sign of sin carried too far. They whispered that his likeness to himself was punishment, that the missing father's name was evidence of bloodlines doubled back in secrecy. These families avoided the pew he sat in, shifting further down the row, until gaps stretched like scars in the congregation. When prayers were raised, they did not speak his name but muttered pleas for deliverance, as if he himself were an affliction in their midst. Others believed differently. To them, the blank space in the record was not shame but sanctity. They pointed to Scripture, to stories of children conceived without earthly fathers, to miracles hidden in ordinary forms. In private gatherings, they spoke of him not as punishment, but as sign, a vessel chosen for reasons unseen. His stillness, his sameness, his resemblance that began and ended in himself, all of it became proof to them that he was not a blasphemy, but a miracle. The divide showed itself most clearly in sermons. The pastor's words, once steady, grew halting as he tried to keep the hollow together. He preached of mystery, of faith untested, but the congregation no longer heard him as one. Some nodded, seeing his caution as acknowledgement of divinity. Others scowled, certain he feared calling sin by its name. Before long, the church was no longer full. Families began to remain at home on the Sabbath, gathering in kitchens or barns, praying in their own voices rather than beside those they no longer trusted. The hymns grew thin. The echo in the rafters strained. Children noticed first, that the pews near the boy were emptier each week, till one Sunday he sat nearly alone. To see him, there was to be reminded of the fracture, a living rift between faiths. The church bells rang, but their call no longer carried the same obedience. Behind closed doors, the words grew sharper. Blasphemy, sign, curse, chosen. The same child held opposite meanings, dividing families that had once intermarried so closely they were inseparable. Now they stood apart in belief, one side fearful of contamination, the other protective, as if guarding something holy. The boy himself gave no answer. He attended service as before, his gaze steady, his expression unchanged. If he heard the whispers, he never spoke of them. If he noticed the emptiness of the pews, he never altered his place. His silence only deepened the unease, allowing each side to see in him what they already believed. Years later, when investigators revisited the hollow, they found proof that the divide had rooted even in private devotion. Among the artifacts collected was a family Bible, its pages worn by generations of hands. There, on the genealogy leaf, the boy's name was written twice, once in the line of fathers, once in the line of children. What did it mean? That in the very book of faith, he stood both as sire and as son. The parish had lost its ledgers to sealed files, but not every record of the Hollow's families could be taken. Some survived in homes, bound not by law, but by devotion. The family Bible was one such artifact, a volume passed through generations, its pages softened by touch, its margins darkened with the oils of hands that had turned them again and again. It was within this book that investigators, years later, found the most troubling entry. In the genealogy pages, where families carefully recorded births, marriages, and deaths, his name appeared not once but twice. The first inscription lay where it should have been, in the column of children, beneath his mother's name. The date of his birth was there, the place, and the baptismal note, copied from parish memory. Nothing in that line was unusual, save the absence of a father's name beside it. But further down the page, in a different hand and darker ink, his name returned. This time it was written among the fathers, positioned above a line of dependents that bore no separate surname. The letters were firm, deliberate, without hesitation. No one could mistake it for an error. The same name, the same boy, placed both as offspring and progenitor, recorded as though he had been both born and begotten in himself. The unease this caused cannot be overstated. Family Bibles were trusted more deeply than any parish record, considered sacred even when the church faltered. To see the boy's name appear twice within its pages was to face a truth set down not by officials, but by kin. The entry was not accidental. It was intentional, inscribed with the same reverence given to every birth and death before it. Some suggested that the second entry must have been the work of a grieving hand, a mistake born of sorrow or confusion. Others argued that the handwriting was too steady, the ink too bold for error. To them, it was proof that the family themselves believed what the hollow had whispered, that the boy was both father and son, that no other lineage could be written because none existed beyond him. When word of the Bible spread, neighbors began to avoid the house more openly. To own such an artifact was to confirm the rumors, to give them permanence in ink. Families that had once shared meals or fields with his kin began to look away on the road, to keep children inside when the boy passed. The Bible did not unite faith as it had been meant to do. It divided, setting the family apart from the rest of the hollow, sealing them inside their own ancestry. The artifact remained, passed quietly to investigators, its pages photographed and locked in county storage. But its meaning lingered long after it left the hollow. The boy's name, written twice, remained as a mirror in Scripture, reflecting itself without end. It was after the discovery of the Bible that the community itself began to turn. Neighbors who once tolerated the strangeness now recoiled in earnest. Doors closed, paths grew empty, And soon, the family's house stood abandoned, its windows shuttered against the eyes that no longer wished to see. After the Bible was spoken of, the family found themselves no longer merely whispered about, but avoided outright. What had once been sidelong glances became open distance. Neighbors, who once stopped to exchange greetings, now crossed the road before reaching their gate. Children, who had played in the yard, were called back indoors at the sight of him, their laughter falling silent as shutters closed behind them. The house itself began to take on the weight of its reputation. Curtains remained drawn even in daylight, giving the windows a dark, unblinking stare. Smoke no longer rose regularly from the chimney, though it was said the hearth still burned within. Visitors stopped coming. Deliveries of food and supplies were left at the end of the path, rather than carried to the door. In time, even that ceased, as if proximity alone carried danger. The family remained within for a while, enduring the recoil with a silence equal to that which surrounded them. When the boy appeared in public, walking beside his mother, faces turned away. Farmers let their plows idle. Shopkeepers pretended to rearrange goods, and women with baskets pulled their children closer. The effect was not sudden violence, but slow severing, a social excommunication that required no decree. Children learned to treat the house as forbidden ground. They whispered of the Bible inside, of the boy's face pressed against the glass, of the mirrors in the rooms that showed only him. Few dared approach the path, and those who did swore the silence around it was heavier than the silence of the woods. To pass by was to feel watched, though the curtains never stirred. The shunning grew so complete that the family's absence from church was barely noted. Where once pews had emptied around them, now their seats were simply left vacant. The pastor ceased mentioning their names. The hollow learned to move without them, to live as though they were already gone. In time, the house itself stood empty. No one saw them leave. Yet neighbors woke one morning to find the shutters nailed, the path grown over, the well untended. A single chair was left on the porch, its legs sinking slowly into the soil, as if it had been placed there to mark departure. No sale was recorded, no transfer of property made. The family had dissolved into absence, and the hollow accepted it as though it had been inevitable. The abandoned homestead became a landmark of silence. Windows blackened by dust gave no reflection. Doors held fast by rusted hinges refused entry. Travelers noted it but did not linger. Locals passed it without acknowledgement. It was as if the hollow had erased not only the family, but its memory of them, leaving behind only wood, stone, and soil to hold their place. Yet outside the hollow, their absence stirred another kind of silence. The silence of files locked away, names struck from records, histories rewritten into nothing. For while the community recoiled, the institutions that governed them were doing the same, erasing page after page until the boy no longer existed in official ink. The parish had always been the keeper of memory, but even its pages were not beyond revision. Some time after the family vanished, the baptismal ledger was returned. Thinner than before, its margins scraped, the ink overlaid with new strokes. Where once the boy's entry had left a blank for father, there was now a faint scrawl, illegible but present, as if a name had been forced into the silence. Yet those who compared the handwriting swore it did not match the clerk's original hand. The correction seemed less a record than a disguise. The county courthouse followed a harsher method. In its archives, officials removed entire folders, labeling them consolidated, before consigning them to flames. Witnesses recalled the scent of burning paper, drifting from the courthouse chimney for days, the smoke said to carry whole lifetimes into ash. Boxes labeled with the hollow's name were emptied, their contents never replaced. When clerks searched years later, they found only gaps in the shelves, wide enough to suggest deliberate removal. Even the infirmary's journals, known for their meticulous retention, bore signs of subtraction. Volumes were intact, but pages were cut cleanly away, leaving a sequence of blank stubs where entries once resided. The gap fell exactly where the boy's name should have been. Physicians who had written of unclassified resemblance and appearance without source now found their own words excised, their records silenced as though they had never been penned. Newspapers, too, played their part in forgetting. Issues from the years surrounding the boy's life contained no mention of him, no column of curiosity, no report of intervention. Editors explained it away as irrelevance. The county had no shortage of births or baptisms to print, and one child was hardly newsworthy. Yet those who remembered swore otherwise, that notes had been written, drafts prepared, then discarded before reaching press. The silence of the printed page was no accident. It was policy. What remained was absence, layered upon absence. The hollow no longer spoke his name aloud. The parish rewrote its own books. The county destroyed its files, and the press left no trace. The boy became less a figure than a blank space, his existence surviving only in the unease of those who remembered him. Each erasure deepened the mystery, till the very act of forgetting became part of his story. Yet erasure is never complete. Even as institutions struck his name from their records, whispers persisted. Families who had known him still glanced at children born years later, remarking, too quietly, that certain faces bore his likeness, a slope of the jaw, a set of the eyes, a stillness that felt inherited. These traits appeared in households where his name had long since been denied, as if lineage moved beneath paper and law, refusing to be contained. The cover-up sealed the files, burned the ink, and silenced the presses, but in doing so, it left only rumor to fill the void, and rumor proved harder to destroy. For long after the institutions declared him erased, voices still asked, did his line end in the abandoned house, or does it continue still, carried quietly in the faces of those who walk the hollow today? The house on the ridge stood abandoned, its windows blind, its path swallowed by grass. Yet absence did not end the story. In the years that followed, the boy was spoken of not in ledgers or sermons, but in whispers that drifted beyond the hollow. Travelers passing through carried fragments of the tale to nearby towns. A child whose name was entered twice, once as son and once as father. A family Bible with ink that mirrored itself. A household erased yet never entirely gone. In those towns, people began to look differently at faces they did not recognize. A certain repetition in the jawline of a stranger. The stillness of eyes that seemed too knowing for youth. The unchanging expression of a young man seen year after year. All became reasons to whisper. He carries the look, some would murmur. The same face. Others insisted it was only imagination. But the doubt lingered, persistent as breath on glass. Genealogists who attempted to trace the family line found their work frustrated. Pages of census rolls were missing. Ledgers edited. Hospital journals cut clean. The gaps were too precise to be accident, too consistent to be neglect. Where the boy should have been traceable forward, into marriage, children, and descendants, the records fell silent. And yet, in nearby registers, certain surnames appeared with uncanny frequency, names that had once belonged to the hollow, and nowhere else. The silence of the institutions did not erase what the living saw. Farmers noted the resemblance in hired hands. Teachers whispered that some pupils bore the same unsettling sameness of feature, a resemblance that never seemed to shift with age. Families denied the connection, yet neighbors observed the likeness, even if only from a distance. It was as though the boy's image had seeped into the blood of the ridge and would not be washed away. In time, the story itself took the form of a warning. Parents in nearby towns told children not to wander into the hollow, not because of wolves or terrain, but because of the bloodlines folded too tightly within. They spoke of a face that repeated itself, generation after generation, till no one could say where it began or where it ended. He is his own father, they would whisper, half mockery, half prayer, the words passed down as though part of the landscape itself. Even today, when the official archives are consulted, the silence remains. The parish ledger shows only gaps. The courthouse shelves only voids. Files that should exist do not. Pages that should explain have been torn away. What endures is rumor, of descendants who walk unnoticed, of families that never left the ridge, of children born with faces that seem too familiar to be new. The records are gone. The house is gone. The names are gone. Yet the unease persists, as if something still moves quietly beneath the surface of the living. How can a boy be his own father? And what becomes of a bloodline that begins and ends in the same face? Thank you for examining this record with us. If these sealed accounts and vanished names should continue to be told, make sure you like this video and subscribe to Classified Ledger, because what you've just heard is not invention, but the fragments that remain when history tries and fails to erase itself.